Greetings to all the fighters, to commissars, to comrades, and all the progressive forces in all parts of the world. We send particular greetings to all the revolutionary Marxist and communist and socialist forces in all parts of the world, because today we're going to discuss one of the most important perspectives, the most important pamphlet in the history of the modern world. We're going to discuss the Manifesto of the Communist Party, otherwise known as the Communist Manifesto. So the Manifesto of the Communist Party was adopted in 1848. In 1848 is 172 years ago. So despite that the Communist Manifesto was adopted 172 years ago, it still carries the weight, the relevance, the validity of ideas that it carried 172 years ago, because it is founded on scientific socialism. It was written by the scientific socialists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So like Karl Marx is one of the greatest thinkers to ever live in the history of the modern world. The Communist Manifesto itself, it is the most referenced political perspective in the history of the modern world, meaning that from the year 1 until the year 2020, the most referenced political perspective is the Communist Manifesto. And it is, of course, the most influential political perspective. And it is the most banned political perspective and document in the history of the modern world. So many countries, many authorities, and even in some instances, many institutions have banned the Communist Manifesto. There are lots of institutions of higher learning in many parts of the world that did not want to be associating with the Communist Manifesto. So it is important that as political revolutionary activists, as ordinary South Africans, as ordinary people anywhere in the world, we should at least have an appreciation of what is this Communist Manifesto that is the most influential, is the most referenced, and is the most banned political perspective in the history of the world. So actually, if you were to compare it, like if you were to compare it to the religious texts, the Communist Manifesto in terms of referencing, it is the third most referenced perspective after the Quran or after the Bible. So that is how significant this perspective is. It is not a religious perspective. It is a political perspective. That is why our presentation today of the Communist Manifesto is going to be a political presentation. But before we get into the presentation of the Communist Manifesto, we have to deal essentially with key concepts and the key terms, key definitions of the words and the concepts that are associated with the Communist Manifesto. We have to do so that all of us are at par in terms of this discussion that we're going to have just now. And just to give you an overview of the feel you're going to have later on when we discuss the Communist Manifesto, is that it is not a very long document. It has got a preamble and four sections. Section 1 is called the Bourgeois and Proletarians. Section 2 is called the Proletarians and Communists. Section 3 is called Socialist and Communist Literature. Section 4 is called the Position of Communists in relation to various opposition parties. So we're going to then deal with all those four sections later on. And in totality, those four sections give a clearer context of what is called historical materialism. They give a clearer context of class formation, capitalist class formation, how capitalism gave birth to two contending classes. And then they give a clearer expression of what we call by property. What is private property, and how do you treat private property in relation to personal property? And then it articulates in the Communist Manifesto a clear program of what should constitute the program of all communist forces in all parts of the world. And then it concludes by saying, workers of the world unite, because we have got nothing to lose but our chains. But that is not the immediate discussion we're going to enter into now. Now, we are dealing with the conceptual foundation. This is very important. So we must pay detailed attention to the conceptual foundation of the Communist Manifesto and in terms of what we're dealing with now. Now, the key concepts we're going to define is 1, capitalism, 2 is socialism, communism, the state, and then we'll define what is Marxism so that we understand the context of this discussion properly. Now, what is capitalism? Capitalism is a mode of production where the means of production are owned by a private individual and the production and distribution of goods and products is meant for profit purposes. What does that mean? It means that the process of producing goods and products, of producing food, of producing clothes, of producing cars, of producing shelter is the process that is owned by private individuals. And they are engaged in socialized production. In the production, they employ workers, they involve other people in the production, but they take profits for themselves. They are called the capitalists or the bourgeoisie. So in the Communist Manifesto, it uses the word bourgeoisie to refer to those who own the means of production and the society through which such mode of production is dominant is called the bourgeois society or a capitalist society. That is what capitalism is. And what is interesting and an interesting observation about capitalism is that it doesn't produce goods and products in response of the needs of the people. It does not respond to the needs of the people. So capitalists do not produce food, do not produce clothes or build houses or provide basic shelter or basic health care because they are responding to a need. They only do that because they want to achieve the profit motive, which is called surplus value in Marxist terms. So surplus value basically refers to profit. That is what capitalism is. That is why also when capitalism enters into a crisis, it is only when it has overproduced goods and services. So, in the past, in the historical development of society, under primitive societies, under slavery, under feudalism, crisis would only define humanity when there is shortage of goods and basic products that were needed for human survival, for human subsistence. But under capitalism, the crisis of capitalism is a crisis of overproduction and underconsumption. So you must go and read separately about that, and it's a discussion which we must have on a separate date. So that is what capitalism is, that it's a mode of production where the means of production are privately owned and the production is happening for private purposes. And in the process of production, it employs the labor of people. It actually takes ordinary people. It turns the entire population into a base of the working class, the proletariat, which it employs to make profit for itself. And in that bourgeois society created, you then have produced two distinct classes, which is the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, or they are called the capitalists and the working class. Or in maybe sometimes in modern references, they say those who are rich and the poor. That is what capitalism is all about. It produces a society of rich people this side and poor people this side. And the poor people are involved together with these ones in the production of goods that are needed for human survival. But those goods and services When they are sold in the market, the people who appropriate the most of value out of that is the capitalists themselves. That is what capitalism is. And why are we against capitalism? Fundamentally because it produces poverty. We do not want to have poverty in society. That is why we're against capitalism. Capitalism produces inequality. That is why the global 1% of the top population in the world has got more wealth than the bottom 80%. Meaning that few individuals have got more resources than they need. And those resources are equal to the resources or more than the resources of more than 7 billion people. That is the nature of capitalism. In America, they've got 8 billionaires who are richer than 80% of the population. In the entire world, you have got about 9 billionaires, you must check Oxfam reports, who are richer than more than 4.6 billion people. In South Africa, you have got 5 billionaires who are richer than 26 million people, which is more than half the population of South Africa. That is the nature of capitalism, that it reproduces inequalities and it doesn't even try to lower inequalities, it always expands them. So if you were to check in the history of capitalism, the more the capitalist system of production matures, the more inequality finds expression, as long as there is no revolutionary socialist movement to discontinue such levels of inequality and such levels of capitalist exploitation. But also capitalism destroys the environment. In pursuit of profits, capitalists do not care about the environment. They destroy the world. In some instances, they can even create diseases so that they can make profit out of the cure of those diseases. They are responsible, the capitalists are responsible for global warming in search of profit. It is not the working class, which by the way is majority in the world, that is responsible for global warming. It is the capitalists that are responsible for the environmental degradation. It's a very important concept in terms of what happens. Now, that is why we are against capitalism. We are for socialism. What is socialism? Socialism is a mode of production that is basically a transition from capitalism to communism. Now, the philosophers have historically come to the acceptance that society has developed historically and in Marxist terms from different stages of human development, from primitive society to slavery to feudalism, that capitalism is just but a phase of human societal development. Then Karl Marx says that capitalism is not the end state. Capitalism actually should not be the end state. That is Karl Marx's greatest contribution to scientific socialism. To say capitalism is not the end state. The end state must be communism. But before you get to communism, you need to go via a stage called socialism. And he says himself that, as for myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle that exists between them. He says that long before me, bourgeois historians and bourgeois economists, they had discovered the existence of classes and they discovered the contradictions that exist in those classes. And then he says that what I did that was new, that I have been able to prove as a scientific socialist, is one that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. That is what Karl Marx says. And he says, two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. We'll explain what that is now. And then 3, that the dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. So socialism refers to the transition from capitalism to communism. So that is the Karl Marx's greatest contribution. And I want to make reference as well to some of the greatest contributors to socialist theory. And I think the quote that actually defines better and clearly what socialism is a quote that is contained in a perspective called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics by Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping is one of the most outstanding leaders of the Communist Party of China. He led the Communist Party of China during difficult moments, and he made those difficult moments to be not so difficult moments by a thorough application of socialist theory. And what does it say? It's a very long quote, but I'm going to go through it so that all of us are able to understand this clearly. Deng Xiaoping says that what is Marxism and what is socialism? And it says that we have not been very clear in the past about what this is all about. We have said that socialism is the primary stage of communism, and that at the advanced stage, the principles of each according to his ability, to each according to his needs will be applied. This calls for highly developed productive forces. This calls for highly developed productive forces. Productive forces is the industry, is the technology that must be advanced and must be developed so that you are able to meet the needs of the people. It's about cultivation of nature to meet the needs of the people, to meet the basic needs of the people, which is food, which is shelter, which is the basic things that are needed for human subsistence and human survival. And then Deng Xiaoping further says that the superiority of the socialist system is demonstrated in the final analysis by faster and greater development of those forces than under capitalist system. That in that transition, although capitalism develops industry, achieves this and that, but under a socialist system, the development of the productive forces must be faster and must be much more effective and better than how it would be under a capitalist system. And then it then further says that as they develop, the people's material and cultural life will constantly improve. That as the productive forces are developed substantially, the people's material and cultural life will constantly improve. One of the shortcomings after the founding of the People's Republic of China was that they did not pay attention enough to development of the productive forces. Socialism means eliminating poverty. Pauperism is not socialism, still less communism. That is very important, that socialism does not mean collective poverty. It means collective wealth. It means we must be wealthy, all of us. We must develop the productive forces commonly so that we are able to then benefit out of it. That is a very important contribution, because a lot of people think that communism means that you must be poor. It doesn't mean so. It means the contrary. Communism and socialism, it's not poverty. It is collective wealth for all of us, so that we are able to live meaningful lives in a way that it is. Now, the other important quote that is important to give clearer context to what socialism is, we have to dwell on this so that we understand what we're dealing with later on. It's a quote by Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah is known as the high priest of Pan-Africanism, committed to the unification of the African continent. But one distinguishing and one commendable feature of Kwame Nkrumah is that he's a scientific socialist. He believes in the Marxist analysis of history. He understands the materialist conception of history. He understands the political economic analysis of Karl Marx. He understands the scientific socialism of Marxism. Clearly than many other theorists on socialist theory. And then he says that socialism in Africa introduces a new social synthesis in which modern technology is reconciled with human values, in which the advanced technical society is realized without the staggering social malfunctions and deep schisms of capitalist industrial society. That is what Kwame Nkrumah says. And an interesting observation he says is that it is the elimination of fancifulness from socialist action that makes socialism scientific. To suppose that they are tribal, national, or racial socialisms is to abandon objectivity in favor of chauvinism. So you must look into that perspective by Kwame Nkrumah when he was drawing a distinction between African socialism and socialism in Africa. There's a perspective called African Socialism Revisited that is written by Kwame Nkrumah. You must go and look into that. It will empower your understanding of what socialism is, particularly in the continental context. And the other important quote which we cannot ignore in terms of defining what socialism is, it's a quote by Chris Hani. Chris Hani was a leader of the Communist Party in South Africa when it used to exist. It doesn't exist anymore. Chris Hani says that socialism is not about big concepts and heavy theory. Socialism is about decent shelter for those who are homeless. It is about water for those that do not have safe drinking water. It is about health care. It is about dignity for the old. It is about overcoming the huge divide between rural and urban areas. It is about a decent education for all our people. Socialism is about rolling back the tyranny of the market. As long as the economy is dominated by an unelected privileged few, the case for socialism will always exist. That is what Chris Hani says, that socialism in that transitional phase, there has to be the basic necessities of our people provided. So when we say we're fighting for socialism, we're fighting for those basic necessities. And that can only be achieved through dictatorship of the proletariat, but through development of the productive forces. I said earlier that we'll come back to what is dictatorship of the proletariat. So the proletariat is the working class. So under a socialist society, the working class, who is the majority, must be the class that presides over society. Its interest must seek to suppress the interest of the capitalist. Lenin in State and Revolution properly clarifies what is this democratic dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's not a contradiction to say democratic dictatorship of the proletariat. So the majority engaged in democratic means suppresses the interest of the bourgeoisie in a transitional phase that seeks to develop the productive forces to cater for the basic necessities of all the people. And then Lenin says that in a capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, that is wretched, that is false, a democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will for the first time create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the existing exploiters of the minority. Communism alone is capable of providing really complete democracy, and that more complete it is, the more complete it is, the sooner it will become unnecessary and wither away out of its own accord. That is very important observation to say that under capitalism, democracy really is for the capitalist, for the dominant class, that is existing in that particular context. I think we've dealt sufficiently with socialism. We had to stay there a little bit longer because we should understand, particularly the struggle for scientific economic freedom in our lifetime. For socialist economic freedom in our lifetime should be understood with a full appreciation of what socialism is. And communism refers to the end state of human development, where the goods and products will be distributed in the formula which is called from each according to ability to each according to need. And as I already said in that quote of Lenin from State and Revolution, what is important is that the state will begin to wither away in a communist society. It will be a classless society, so there won't be a class that is dominating over another class, because we will all be commonly owning the means of production. We would have socialized the production and distribution of all the resources and the basic goods and products that are needed for human survival and subsistence. That is what communism is. And there is currently no communist society in the world. We've got socialist progressive transition in China. We've got a socialist Cuba. We've got some degree of socialism in Vietnam. We've got some degree of questionable socialism in North Korea. But it is important to highlight what is happening in China is that since Deng Xiaoping's proper contextualization of socialism, that it's about the development of productive forces, China has been developing the productive forces in a far much superior and faster way than any other part of the capitalist world, and even in comparison to the capitalist history. So if you were to check the measures of so-called economic growth in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping made those observations, when he began to redefine the essence of socialism with Chinese characteristics, you will realize that the GDP per capita was far less than $400 per capita, but currently it's at more than $8,000 per capita. And China has been able to take more than 850 million people out of absolute poverty because of socialist development of the productive forces. If you were to go and check the development of the key issues and the distribution of resources in Cuba, you will realize that in Cuba there's no illiteracy. Healthcare is guaranteed access. Everyone is guaranteed access to quality healthcare. That is why Cuba can send medical doctors, more than 40,000 medical doctors from outside its country, to go and help other countries, because socialism and communism is defined by progressive internationalism in the manner that it is. I think we've dealt with that in the immediate, and South Africa is a capitalist society with the bourgeoisie and the working class. And we need a socialist transition to deal with the dominance of the white bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie in South Africa, the capitalists, are almost exclusively white because of colonialism and apartheid. So we've got racial capitalism, racist capitalism in South Africa, which is neo-colonial in character. We'll have that discussion in a separate occasion. And that is why we employ Marxism, Leninism as the economic freedom fighters to defeat racist capitalism, to defeat the dominance of few white minorities over the majority, where they are the rich and majority of the black working class population are the poor, in the manner in which capitalist society reproduces itself. Now, we must define what is the state. It is important to give this important the discussion of the state. It is also the foundation of the Marxist-Leninist conceptualization of the state is this Communist Manifesto that we are discussing now. We're going to make a reference to it when we go to chapter 1. But chapter 1 makes an interesting observation that the modern bourgeoisie, that in the historical development of capitalism, that the modern bourgeoisie has established itself a state, meaning that the bourgeoisie has, at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. That is what Karl Marx says. But that, like, let's take a Leninist conceptualization of what the state is, and we have to be patient with this concept so that we are able to clearly understand the Communist Manifesto. Now, the state, Lenin defines in a perspective called the State and Revolution, that the state is basically composed of three components. One, that it is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. What does that mean? It sounds difficult, but it's not difficult. It is to say that since we all accept that the history of the thus far existing society is the history of class struggle, that the historical stages of human development, in the societal development, primitive society, slavery, feudalism, capitalism. So in all societies which had classes, like which had a dominant class, like slave owners, like feudal lords, like capitalists, that the state then emerges. Initially, it is emerging as if it is a reconciler of the class antagonisms, of the class differences, of the class contradictions that define a class-divided society. But it does not become so. It becomes an instrument of class rule. So to say that the state is a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms is to say that it emerges out of a class-divided society to manage interest, but fundamentally, the state is an instrument of class rule. It is a body for the oppression of one class over another. And to legitimate its continued oppression of one class over another, it needs a special bodies of armed men. So that is a component of the state, like the special bodies of armed men, the police, the military, the prisons. That is what defines the state, that its legitimacy is derived out of the fact that it has got a monopoly over violence. That is what defines the state. That is why in some instances, when people have to take over states through undemocratic means, they use violence. There's a violent overthrow of a state. Sometimes the military, the most important component of the state, just overthrows the state. So that is what the state is. That one, it is a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. Two, it is a special bodies of armed men. But three, it's an instrument for the oppression of one class by another class. That is what the state is. And even in democracies, the so-called democracies, bourgeois democracies, this state, which is narrowly defined as parliament, executive, and government, or the executive, it always acts on behalf and for the protection of the ruling class. To the extent that when there is conflict between workers and the capitalists in Marikana, the state will send its armed bodies of men to go and kill workers. That is what it does everywhere. So the interest of the working of the capitalist always dominate the agenda of the state, even its constitution and majority of the times its values. And then of course, it is constantly contested. Its direction is contested. That is why we have got revolutionary movements that exist within a capitalist society to contest the direction of the state, knowing that this is an instrument of class rule. It is here to protect the interest of the bourgeoisie. That is what a state is in the manner that we have then defined. Now, what is Marxism? Marxism refers to the body of ideas, a body of knowledge, the philosophy that is agitating the working class to overthrow the capitalist system. So Marxism it's a scientific social science, scientific social theory, philosophy that empowers the working class to appreciate that capitalism is not the end state. We must fight as a class. We must constitute ourselves as a class and fight for a transition to communism. And we should appreciate that there should be a socialist transition in that transition. That is what Marxism is. And Lenin wrote a very interesting perspective called the three sources and three component parts of Marxism, and said that component number one is materialism, historical materialism. Component number two is political economy. Component number three is scientific socialism, and that the historical materialist concept, the materialist conception of history of Karl Marx, the one which he says that I have discovered that the world, the manner in which it has got to develop, these are different stages of historical development, and that capitalism is not the end state. So that is mostly influenced by German philosophy, and the political economy is influenced by thorough study of English political economy. The source is English political economy. And the scientific socialism is influenced by French socialism. And one thing, comrades, which you must appreciate, all fighters, is that don't ever think that to understand Marxism, to understand communism, you must only study communist and socialist literature. You must broaden your understanding of the existing capitalist system, how it operates. It's a very complex system in the age of financialization, of stock markets, of a variety of other things, of cryptocurrencies in the recent past, of artificial intelligence, of robotics, that are going to reposition capitalism in a different format. You should at all times appreciate all these dynamics. Karl Marx did that. But he did not just do that. He was engaged in the agitation of the working class to overthrow capitalism. Now, although Marxism are ideas that are originally coming from Karl Marx, the body of knowledge that is called Marxism is also enhanced and harnessed by Friedrich Engels, by Vladimir Lenin, by Leo Trotsky, by Antonio Gramsci, by Kwame Nkrumah, by Amilcar Cabral, by revolutionary socialist forces, by Deng Xiaoping. I would say that by Xi Jinping as well, the current president of China. You must go and read Xi Jinping's commemoration of the 200th birthday of Karl Marx in 2018 and understand why is Marxism relevant currently. What is the relevance of Marxism in practice now? Not in an archaic and outdated fashion. So Marxism is the body of ideas, of knowledge, of philosophy, of political economic thoughts, of scientific socialism that fundamentally is inspired by Karl Marx, but it's a theory of agitation. Karl Marx says himself that the philosophers have interpreted the world. The aim, however, is to change it. That is what Karl Marx says, that it's about taking society forward. And throughout his existence and throughout his theorization, Karl Marx always used to expose the weaknesses of people who call themselves socialists, but were mostly wishing for a backward movement. So there's something called feudal socialists who think that, no, capitalism is bad, but for us to organize ourselves better, we must go backward. That is what is the weakness of some of the forces even in recent revolutionary movements. Now, that is what Marxism is. I think that we have dealt sufficiently with the conceptual foundation. Now, we're going to then deal with the Communist Manifesto. And before we do that, we must appreciate and actually emphasize something, that Marxism is scientific socialist thought and science. So in as much as Isaac Newton discovered the law of gravity, in as much as Charles Darwin discovered the law of evolution, in as much as Michael Faraday discovered electricity, in as much as Albert Einstein discovered the theory of relativity, in as much as in medical sciences, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, in as much as Niels Bohr discovered the quantum theory, Karl Marx discovered a socialist scientific theory that is being employed by progressive working class forces in all parts of the world to defeat capitalism. You know, there's an interesting quote which comes from Frederick Engels. You know, like Karl Marx was born in 1818 and he died in 1883 on the 14th of March. So at the funeral of Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, who was his biggest collaborator, said something very interesting, and I think I must just mention that before I go deeper into the Communist Manifesto. He says that on the 14th of March at 2:45 in the afternoon, the greatest living thinker ceased to think. And then he says that just as Darwin discovered the law of development or organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. The simple fact hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, and religion. And then he says in conclusion that his name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work. That is why we're here discussing Marxism today, because of the greatest living thinker who ceased to think on the 14th of March, 1883. And there is still relevance to what he stands for. Now, the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto, as we have said, is the most influential political pamphlet in the modern history. And that is very important to highlight because it influenced the formation of so many communist parties. It has been banned in many parts of the world. It has been bastardized. It has been banished. It has been treated with disdain. It has been declared all sorts of names. It has been declared part of conspiracy theory. It has been declared crime. It has been declared all sorts of things. And why is that the case? It's because it speaks to scientific socialism, whose fundamental idea is to overthrow the dominance of capitalism in society. That is the essence of the Communist Manifesto. And as we have said, 4 sections of the Communist Manifesto. 4 sections. 1 is called Bourgeois and Proletarians. 2 is called Communists and Proletarians, Proletarians and Communists. 3 is called the Socialist and Communist Literature. 4 is called the position of communists in relation to various opposition parties. Now, we need to then move to all those sections so that we can understand clearly. Section 1 of the Communist Manifesto starts with the historical quote. One of the most referenced quotes in the Communist Manifesto is the one that is a historical materialist observation that says that the history of the hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. That is the first sentence that is contained in section 1 of the Communist Manifesto to say that the history of the thus far existing society has been the history of class antagonisms or class struggle. That sometimes the class struggle might appear hidden, sometimes it's open, where there's open confrontation of the contending classes. That is where it comes from, to say that this is where we come from as a people. And then in the Communist Manifesto in section 1 details the development of capitalism. And it actually even goes to as far as saying that the bourgeois revolution has been progressive in as far as the destruction of feudal mode of production is concerned. That in as far as the destruction of the feudal system, capitalism has been very progressive. And why? Because it revolutionized industry. It actually made it easier to cultivate nature for human survival. It produced a lot of things, including technology, the machinery, a variety of other things. It constantly does that. It introduced new forms of trade, and it actually illustrates that the discovery of America, the rounding up of the Cape, has been part of that industrial development, which in as far as destruction of feudal mode of production is progressive. So someone will come and say, no, the Communist Manifesto says that the Communist Manifesto is saying that capitalism is progressive. No, it is not progressive. It was progressive in as far as the destruction of the feudal mode of production is concerned. And there's an interesting thing that we must go and look into, because in the 1882 edition of the Communist Manifesto, the preface, the last one, which was written jointly by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx begins to have a deeper appreciation that in a Russian context, it will be revolutionary for communist forces from even peasant society, without waiting for the development of capitalism, can develop the productive forces in a faster and much more efficient way than capitalism would do. So you must go and look the preface to the Russian edition, 1882. That is the last preface which Karl Marx wrote to the Communist Manifesto. Now, the section 1 then details that historical development of capitalism, but also it then deals with an important observation that this bourgeois society has produced two contending classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Actually, in the Communist Manifesto, the exact quote says that our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, however this distinct feature is, it has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes, directly facing each other, which is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That is what the Communist Manifesto says in section 1, that capitalism is producing two contending classes that are now facing each other. And then it makes a very interesting observation that what the bourgeois society therefore produces, above all, are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So to say that whilst the bourgeois society is producing the two contending classes, the proletariat is ultimately going to be the grave diggers. It is going to be the core of the collapse of the capitalist system, of the bourgeois society, that that the capitalist system produces the working class, who are going to be the one that overthrows the bourgeois system, the bourgeois mode of production, which is capitalism. That is interesting. And then the other component that is highlighted in section 1 is what we had already mentioned and defined in the state, that the modern bourgeois society has acquired for itself a state that the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry, it has conquered itself exclusive political sway. That the executive of the modern bourgeoisie is nothing but a committee that manages the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. That is what it is. So the executive of the modern bourgeois state, you must just actually look for many examples wherever you are of how the bourgeoisie dictates on the decisions of the executive. That is how it is. And these definitions are made in a Communist Manifesto, which we said was adopted 172 years ago. We're going to dwell on these things, comrades. We must be very patient because it is a necessary discussion which we must understand, all of us. Time is going to be of essence, but we must stay on this. But the other thing which is mentioned in the section 1 of the Communist Manifesto is that capitalism has created the world in its own image. Like the historical development of capitalism led to the situation where this bourgeois society is trying to create the entire world in its own image. That the bourgeois society compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates the world after its own image. You know how capitalism was introduced in the African continent, through colonial battering, through forced labor, through slavery. That is the nature of capitalism in a manner that it is. So section 1 then that basically deals with those issues. That 1, it makes a historical materialist observation. 2, it speaks to class formation. 3, it makes an observation that the proletariat are produced as grave diggers and they're produced by the bourgeois society. That 3, it speaks about the bourgeoisie creating a state as an executive that manages the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. And that 5, the capitalist bourgeois society creates the world in its own image. That is the essence of section 1 of the Communist Manifesto. Now we're going to go to section 2. It's important to highlight at this time that section 3 and 4 are actually very short. So we're going to dwell a little bit more in section 2. And I know we have been going on this for a very long time. Let us be patient. And I'm sure that we will come back to this later on. We'll take a rest and you will come back to watch and understand this. It's a very important component of what should happen. So chapter 2 starts with asking a question. The question is, in what relation do communists stand in relation to the proletariat as a whole? What is the position of communists in relation to society and the proletariat as a whole? And then it answers by saying that the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. That is what it says, number 1. It says 2, they have no interest separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Number 3, they do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. You know, communist struggles are not sect struggles, like where you've got some quasi-religious obsession with yourself and you think that, and you're always isolated from the rest of society, that you must always be part of the proletariat as part of communist forces. And then the important observation is this one that says that the communists are distinguished from the other working class parties in 2 components. 1, that in the national struggles of the proletariat of different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interest of the entire proletariat independent of nationality. That communists are not xenophobic. They're not narrowly nationalistic. They're not arrested by some narrow nationalism. They're internationalist in character. And that actually speaks to the history of communist forces that were able to defeat colonialism practically, not just through issuing statements, but to that the working class, that in the various stages of development, which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, the communist everywhere and always represents the interest of the movement as a whole. And then the other important thing, which is very important to highlight now, is that the communists, therefore, are on the one hand and practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties. So the communists are the most advanced and the most resolute, that they know what they stand for. They're not wishy-washy. They do not change positions because they've been given cabinet posts. The communists are the most advanced and the most resolute section of all working class parties. That is what it says. And it says lastly that the role of communists also should be to conquer political power. It must push, the communists must push the proletariat to conquer political power by the proletariat. This is a political struggle. Maybe that is why the Communist Manifesto is banned, when it was banned by many areas, because it begins to say that we must conquer political power. If it is through democratic means, it's okay. But if it is through any other revolutionary means, that must be pursued in pursuit of the emancipation of the working class. That is, you must take political power from the existing holders of the political power. And then section 2 then deals substantially with the issue of the property question and highlights something, that the abolition of existing property is the distinct feature of communism. The abolition of private property is not, it actually says it's not a distinct feature of communism. So all property relations in the past have been abolished, right? And then it actually gives an example that the French Revolution, for instance, abolished feudal property, but in favor of bourgeois property. Then the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. In this sense, the theory of the communist may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And there's something that is very important and which has been utilized as part of the anti-communist propaganda. That some people think that when we say that communists are fighting for the abolition of private property, they are going to be dispossessed of their cars, of their houses, of their private clothing, of their basic things. The Communist Manifesto itself says that hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and it is still destroying daily. And then the further says that we as communists, we by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life. That there is no intention to take personal non-exploitative property from people. What is due for expropriation is private property that exploits labor. It actually says that communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. I think that settles this issue of the property questions, because part of the bourgeois objections to the communist credo, to the Communist Manifesto, to the Communist thought, is that it is going to abolish private or personal non-exploitative property. That is not the intention of communists in terms of what happens. But then that part as well of the property then gives a clearer context of capital taking a social status that capital has got a class character if it is privately owned in the manner that it is. Now, there are issues that we must then deal with in relation to Section 2 of the Communist Manifesto. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels deal with these issues very patiently, that there are bourgeois objections to communists. And the Communist Manifesto responds to those bourgeois objections. What are those? One, it's a bourgeois objection that once you abolish private property, you are going to lead to universal laziness. Then it then responds that such is not the case. But I think that the most actually cogent dismissal of such bourgeois objections is something which was said by Che Guevara, a Marxist who understood the context of the Communist Manifesto. He says that man truly achieves his full human condition when he produces without being compelled by the physical necessity of selling himself as a commodity. So under capitalist society, human beings are sold as commodities to factories, to all these systems of production. And they work because they have to survive. So the capitalist system, wherever it exists, in majority of the times, it dispossesses people of their capacity to have subsistence lives. That is why it takes their land, it takes their means of survival, it urbanizes a lot of people, it imposes taxes on them so that they are engaged in waged labor. They are forced to work because without work, you will not be able to survive. You won't be able to have food, clothes, shelter, and all those basic necessities. Che Guevara dismisses that. And then the other component which the bourgeois objections which were happening that time was, it says, we as communists are reproached for wanting to abolish child labor. It says that for that we plead guilty. That is what the Communist Manifesto says, that we plead guilty. We want to abolish child labor. We are not apologetic about that because capitalism at its infant stages used to exploit even children. It was the most brutal form of system. And then it says that to that we plead guilty. We want to abolish child labor. And then in terms of nationalities, the bourgeois objections to nationalities, the communists were reproached that they want to abolish countries. And then in response, the Communist Manifesto says, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, it must constitute itself the nation. It is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. That we must appreciate that although we've got internationalist aspirations, we should be fighting our struggle within a national context. That is what the Communist Manifesto says in terms of what happens. And then the other issue that is dealt with there is on religion. And the dismissal, like it was maybe some intellectual superiority illustration, like it was flexing of intellectual superiority by the authors of the Communist Manifesto. And then they say that on religion, the charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of any serious examination. That is what the Communist Manifesto says. But you must go and look into a separate perspective called a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right by Karl Marx, where it speaks about religion being the opium of the masses. So Marxism doesn't say that we must abolish churches. And those that did so before, they were not being Marxist about it. Marxism says you must abolish private property, and then the material conditions upon which people exist will determine their consciousness. So bourgeois societies, in many instances, they use all forms of ideas they use some degree of idealism to want to divert the working class from the class struggle. So they use religion as a form of stupefaction of the working class, meaning that they make a lot of members of the working class, of the poor, to believe that their poverty, their suffering, their exploitation, their low wages is because they do not pray enough. Their exploitation, their colonization is because they serve a lesser God. That is not what Marxism speaks about. Marxism says that once you liberate people, once you have a class revolution, once you have a socialist society where people realize that there are no classes here, their consciousness, their levels of appreciation of philosophy, of religion, of a variety of other components of what happens in society will be guided by wherever they are. But there is no instruction on destruction of any religious beliefs. Those are private, non-exploitative, unrelated components. But then, of course, we as working class progressive forces, we should always raise the class consciousness of all forces, including those that go to church, to make them appreciate that their exploitation happens because they are a class, not because they serve a lesser God or because they've not surrendered their last penny to a pastor who is going to escape with that man. So that is one of the class consciousness that we must raise everywhere, that we can go to church but still go and fight for the return of the land and still fight for proper working conditions. We'll explain that. You can still fight capitalism even if you believe in the Quran or in the Bible or in Hindu or in ancestors, in whatever form of beliefs that we have. It has got nothing to do with our understanding of what we seek to achieve. So those are the issues that are dealt with as part of the bourgeois objections to the communist movement. Now then it says what then happens? What should happen moving forward? What should constitute our struggle moving forward? It then says that the proletariat must use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production on the hands of the state, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. That is important to say, that the aspiration of the working class forces, of the proletariat, must be to use political power and supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize the instruments of production in the hands of the state, and for the proletariat to organize itself as a ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. So the Communist Manifesto calls for the development of the productive forces, and that happens through taking of political power. That is the important component that is highlighted by the Communist Manifesto. Now, the second, the part that is actually very important in the Communist Manifesto is the one that then deals with the 10 demands of the Communist Manifesto. They're sometimes called the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. We can call them the 10 cardinal pillars of the Communist Manifesto. And what are those? And it says that actually the Communist Manifesto says that these demands might apply in some countries, but they are not, it's not like a one-size-fits-all. but necessarily any communist struggle must pursue the following 10 key aspects. One is that it must be the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. That sounds familiar. The abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Number two is a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Number three is the abolition of all rights of inheritance. That is very important to highlight. Number four is confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels. Number five is centralization of the credit system in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Number six is centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Number seven is extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands and improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. Number eight is equal ability for all to work, establishment of industrial armies, particularly in agriculture. Number nine is combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. Number 10, which is the last one, is free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. Those are the key components and the key demands of the Communist Manifesto. And those who are involved in the struggle for economic freedom in our lifetime, socialist economic freedom in our lifetime, will realize that a lot of those correspond with the 7 cardinal pillars in the manner that it is. The issue of the land, the issue of decentralization of development, the issue of free education, the issue of industrial development everywhere, like full cultivation of the land. So these are the demands that guide all of us in pursuit of socialist economic freedom in our lifetime. And that is what is contained in the Communist Manifesto. Now, the Communist Manifesto, after outlining those key aspects, then comes to say that once we have achieved all of this, in the place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That is the essence of the communist struggles. And that is what the capitalist propaganda has been mobilizing against, because they want to retain their ruling class status in all parts of the world. That is what defines that component. And I've already said that the last 2 sections, which is chapter 3 and 4, or section 3 and 4, are not that detailed, but also in the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had already said that those sections are, of course, important. They said, actually, we can't change this because it is not even our document. It's a document of the Communist Party. But some of the critique that we're giving in relation to opposition parties, in relation to various manifestations of socialisms in different parts, is no longer applicable because most of those formations are no longer existing. But what were those? It was basically saying that these are reactionary socialism, which is feudal socialism, which aspires to go back, petty bourgeois socialism of the insignificant owners of the means of production, like small shop owners who think that they can bargain within an industrial capitalist system for certain rights. and then something called German or True Socialism. A critique of it is provided that those who are aspiring to go back to the German Philistine system. And then there's something called conservative or bourgeois socialism. So that section belongs to so-called economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the conditions of the working class organizations, organizers of charity, like the members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, hole and corner reformers. Like that was a critique of those who think that within a capitalist system you can have reforms that will benefit the working class, and they are not committed to class struggle. And another critique was provided to the critical utopian socialism and communism. Same critique that majority of these socialists, they want to achieve a socialist transition without going through a class struggle that must take political power from the bourgeoisie. That is basically the chapter that deals with socialist and communist literature, section 3, in terms of what it seeks to achieve. And then the last section of the Communist Manifesto is called the position of communists in relation to the various existing parties. And then it starts by reaffirming what already we have dealt with in section 2 of in what relation do the communists stand to the proletariat movement as a whole. And then it starts by saying that we have already made clear the role of communists in chapter 2. That is what the Communist Manifesto says. But it further says that the communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interest of the working class. But in the movement, they present the class character and the property question of the struggle in the fighting for the momentary interests of the working class. That is very important, comrades, that you can't say that the only time we can take up working class struggles, either in parliament or council or legislature, is only when we have defeated capitalism. No. We fight for the momentary interest of the working class. When we fight for insourcing, when we fight for living wages for the working class, when we fight for better protection and working conditions of the working class, those are the momentary interests of the working class. Even when we fight for free education now, before we defeat capitalism, we are fighting for the momentary interest of the working class. That is what we are fighting for. And another important thing that is highlighted in chapter 2, which we're going to then highlight before we conclude this presentation, is that the communists do not, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the overthrow, the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. And then it concludes by saying, let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a will to win. Working men of all countries unite. That is the clarion call of Karl Marx, whom Friedrich Engels said is the greatest living thinker, whom he said his name will endure through the ages, and so will also his work. So that is the Communist Manifesto. I think we have done justice in the presentation of the Communist Manifesto. But there's one thing which I want to highlight, comrades, referring here, is that as communist forces, as revolutionary working class forces, particularly those who are in leadership positions, we should study Marxism. We should study Marxism. We must study our tools of analysis and guide to action. And from time to time, we must seek to improve our levels of understanding. The Communist Manifesto says that we are the most advanced and most resolute sections of the working class parties. So we should understand the essence of what we stand for, so that we're not gullible. You know, the problem with a lot of leaders is that they are gullible, they are very naive, like they're easy to sway this side or this side, because they are not grounded on thorough and proper revolutionary theory and understanding. You can't want to be a leader who doesn't understand and internalize revolutionary theory. So if you have got leadership aspirations, you should be grounded theoretically, ideologically. You must know what the movement stands for, what the working class struggles entails. But importantly, you must internalize something said by Amilcar Cabral, that always bear in mind that people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They are fighting to win the material benefits, to live better and to live in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. That we must always appreciate the relationship between theory and practice. We must build our internal capacity to make practical all the aspirations of the communist movement. So comrades, all of us, let us continue to enhance and harness our understanding of the ideological tools of analysis. Let us continue to fight for the working class. Let us fight for working class unity. Let us stand by the clarion call of the Communist Manifesto that calls for all workers of the world to unite so that we can defeat the nonsensical capitalist system that is subjecting the majority of the people to starvation, to poverty, to high levels of unemployment, to diseases, to preventable deaths. And the only way we can do that is when the working class is united to overthrow politically the bourgeoisie and their representatives. There are so many political parties in the world which are nothing but representatives, committees that manage the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Those who must overthrow and replace with a socialist progressive government in all our nationalities in the entire world. Workers of the world unite, you have got nothing to lose but your chains. Amandla!